They didn't take the money first. That's what nobody understands when I try to explain it. They took my daughter's name off the birth certificate first. I found out on a Tuesday. I know it was a Tuesday because I'd just come off a double shift at the VA clinic where I work as a trauma surgeon, and I still had the particular kind of tired in my bones that only comes from a double, the kind where your hands stop shaking from focus and start shaking from exhaustion. I was sitting in the hospital parking garage in my truck, unwinding for the 10 minutes I allow myself before driving, when my phone buzzed with a notification from the county records portal. Routine update on a document I'd flagged 6 months ago for monitoring. Estate documents tied to my late father's trust. The notification said the primary beneficiary listing had been amended. My daughter's name was gone. My sister had filed the paperwork 3 days after my wife gave birth. I sat in that parking garage for a long time. The engine wasn't running. The garage echoed with the sound of other people going home to their families. I stared at the screen until the words stopped rearranging themselves into something that made sense because they didn't make sense. My sister had always been the one who sent birthday cards on time. She'd planned my wife's baby shower. She cried at the gender reveal. Real tears, the kind that make your shoulders shake. I thought about that for a while. Then I drove home. My wife's name is Camille. She was still in the phase of recovery that looks like someone placed a beautiful person gently on a couch and told them not to move too fast. Our daughter was 6 weeks old. Tiny. Perfect. She made a specific sound when she was hungry that I can only describe as a polite complaint. Like she was mildly disappointed in all of us. I didn't tell Camille what I'd found. Not yet. There are things they teach you in the Marine Corps that don't make the recruiting brochures. One of them is that a confirmed threat is less dangerous than a suspected one, because a confirmed threat can be planned against. So you don't react to the threat. You assess it first. You find its shape in the dark before you turn the lights on. I had a confirmed threat. Now I needed its shape. My father died 14 months ago. Pancreatic cancer, 4 months from diagnosis to funeral. The kind of timeline that doesn't give you enough time to fight and too much time to watch. He was a quiet man who built a landscaping company from a borrowed truck and 2 employees into something worth just under $11 million by the time he retired. He loved his 2 kids equally and demonstrably, which I know because he told us both, often, in the straightforward way men of his generation sometimes do when they've already lost enough people to regret the words they didn't say. His will was specific. The company and its assets were to be held in trust. Upon the birth of a biological grandchild to either of his children, that grandchild would become the primary inheritor, with the surviving parent named as trustee until the child turned 25. There were clauses. If no grandchild existed by a certain date, the estate defaulted to split equally between his 2 children. If a grandchild existed but was ruled ineligible by a court finding of fraud or specific medical criteria listed in an addendum, the same default applied. My daughter was born 8 weeks before that default date. My sister had no children. Her husband had been resistant to the idea for years, a fact she'd relayed to me once with the careful flatness of someone who has stopped fighting about something. She was 41. The window was closing. And with my daughter's name on that trust, my sister's window didn't just close. It locked from the inside. I called my father's estate attorney from my truck the next morning. I told him what I'd found. He was quiet for a moment, then said the amendment had been filed with what appeared to be a valid supporting document, a medical affidavit from a licensed physician stating that the child listed as my daughter was not the biological offspring of the named father. A paternity challenge, filed before my daughter was 6 weeks old. The physician's name on the affidavit was someone I didn't recognize. The filing address was in a suburb I didn't know my sister had any connection to. The affidavit was notarized. I thanked the attorney and told him to freeze any further document changes until he heard from me directly. He said he'd try, but that there were legal limits to what he could do unilaterally. I told him I understood. I hung up and sat with what I knew. My sister and her husband had found a doctor willing to file a false medical affidavit to disinherit my newborn daughter. This wasn't grief talking. This wasn't a misunderstanding about paperwork. This was a plan. I want to be honest about what I felt in that moment, because I think people expect soldiers and surgeons to be composed under pressure in a way that isn't entirely true. Composure isn't the absence of emotion. It's the decision to let emotion exist without letting it drive. What I felt was something large and cold that I recognized from 2 deployments and one very long night in a Fallujah field hospital where I had to make decisions I don't talk about at dinner. I felt it, I named it, and then I set it aside to work. The first thing I did was call the medical licensing board and request a public record on the physician whose name was on the affidavit. Took 40 minutes. What came back was a profile that looked fine on the surface and felt wrong underneath. A doctor who had relocated his practice 3 times in 7 years, who had 2 resolved complaints on file for documentation irregularities, and who had no listed specialty in obstetrics or family genetics, which was the only field that would give him any credibility in a paternity claim. The second thing I did was call a private investigator I'd worked with once on a stolen identity case involving a patient at my clinic. His name was Fogarty. He was expensive, thorough, and blessedly uninterested in drama. I told him what I needed. He said he'd get back to me in 72 hours. The third thing I did was go home and hold my daughter and not say a word to my wife about any of it. That last part was the hardest. Camille knew something was wrong. She's an ICU nurse with 12 years of reading people in the worst moments of their lives, and she applies that skill to me with a precision I find equal parts comforting and inconvenient. She asked me once, quietly, when the baby was asleep between us, if everything was okay with my sister. I said I thought so. I told her I loved her. She watched my face for a second longer than normal, then let it go. Fogarty came back in 60 hours. He'd found the connection between my brother-in-law and the physician. They'd been in the same golf league 4 years ago, before my brother-in-law switched clubs. He'd also found 2 wire transfers from an account belonging to my brother-in-law to an LLC registered in Delaware, which then transferred a nearly identical amount to the physician's personal account, all within the 6 weeks after my daughter was born. It wasn't courtroom ready. Not yet, but it was the shape I needed. I also found, in my father's filing cabinet, the one I'd been putting off going through for months because going through a dead man's filing cabinet is a specific kind of grief, a sealed envelope addressed to me in his handwriting. I thought it was a letter. It wasn't. It was a copy of a conversation, printed and dated, between my sister and my father, transcribed by the home monitoring system my dad had installed after his fall 2 years ago. He'd never told me the system could transcribe audio. I don't think he ever intended to use it that way. The conversation was from 4 months before he died. My sister had been in his house. She'd asked him, in the gentle, circling way people use when they're heading somewhere they don't want to be caught heading, whether the trust could be restructured if there was reason to believe a grandchild might not be legitimate. My father had told her he didn't know what she was implying, and he didn't want to. She'd said she wasn't implying anything. He'd told her the trust was written and settled. She'd left shortly after. He'd sealed the transcript and addressed it to me. He'd known. He'd known she was already thinking about it, and he'd left me the first piece of what I would need. I sat on the floor of his study for a while, then I stood up and went to work. Fogarty connected me with a forensic document specialist who reviewed the medical affidavit within a week. She found 3 inconsistencies in the formatting that suggested the document had been generated from a template not used by any licensed medical board in the state, and that the notary stamp, while real, belonged to a notary whose record showed no appointment logged on the date of the filing. I now had wire transfers, a fraudulent affidavit, a false notarization, and a recorded conversation suggesting premeditation. I did not go to my sister. I did not call my brother-in-law. I did not send a message or an email or show up at their house on a Sunday with the quiet rage of a man who has been betrayed by someone he thought he knew. I went to the district attorney's office. I want to be clear about something. I didn't do this for the money. $11 million matters, and I won't pretend otherwise, but the morning I drove to that office, I passed my daughter's room, and she was awake in her crib looking up at the mobile my father had bought before he got sick, and she made the polite complaint sound even though she wasn't hungry. She just wanted someone to look at her. I stood in the doorway for a minute and looked at her, and I thought about the fact that my sister had tried to erase this child's name from the legal record of our family. That's what I went to the DA's office about. The prosecutor assigned to the case was a woman named Buchanan. She had the manner of someone who has seen a great many people insist their situation was unique, and has developed a precise, non-dismissive way of telling them it wasn't while still taking the case seriously. She went through my documentation without speaking. When she finished, she asked 3 questions, all procedural. Then she said she'd be in touch. It took 11 weeks. 11 weeks of Sunday dinners where my sister held my daughter and said she was the most beautiful baby she'd ever seen. 11 weeks of my brother-in-law giving me a firm handshake and asking about work. 11 weeks of Camille watching my face at the dinner table and not asking what was underneath it because she trusted me to tell her when it was time. I told her on a Wednesday night after the baby was asleep. I sat down across from her at the kitchen table with the folder Fogarty had prepared, and I walked her through all of it from the beginning. She didn't interrupt. She's an ICU nurse. She's good at absorbing information that changes what she thought she knew. When I finished, she was quiet for a moment. Then she said very steadily, "How long have you known?" I told her. She looked at the table. Then she looked at me. "You kept going to those dinners. I needed them not to know I knew." She was quiet again. "The baby was in her arms last week." "I know. I held it together," she said. "But I need you to understand that was very hard." "I know. I'm sorry." She closed the folder. "What happens now?" I told her Buchanan had called me 2 days prior. The grand jury had returned indictments. My sister was being charged with fraud, filing a false legal document, and conspiracy to commit financial elder abuse. The last charge tied to evidence that she and her husband had also been quietly influencing certain decisions during my father's final weeks of illness through his secondary attorney, a man who had since left the state. My brother-in-law faced the same charges plus wire fraud. They were going to be arrested the following morning. Camille nodded slowly. Then she got up, went to the refrigerator, poured herself a glass of water, and stood at the counter drinking it. I didn't say anything. When she was done, she set the glass down and said, "She cried at the baby shower." I know. Real tears. I watched her. I know. I don't understand how a person does that. I didn't have an answer for that. I'm a trauma surgeon. I've spent 15 years understanding what the body does under extreme stress. I have no comparable framework for what a person's moral architecture looks like when it permits them to hold an infant they're actively trying to disinherit and cry at the sight of her. Some questions don't have clean answers. The arrest happened at 7:40 in the morning. I know because Buchanan's office texted me a one-word confirmation, "Done." I was in the kitchen making coffee. Camille was feeding the baby. I showed her the text. She read it and handed the phone back without saying anything, and then she looked at our daughter for a long time. The trial was 8 months later. I won't walk through all of it because some of it was procedural and some of it was painful in the specific exhausting way that legal proceedings are painful, not dramatic, just wearing. My brother-in-law's attorney was skilled and worked hard to frame the wire transfers as gifts and the affidavit as a good faith error, based on information my sister had provided in distress. It was a coherent argument that collapsed the moment Buchanan put the forensic document specialist on the stand. My sister testified in her own defense. She looked like the person I grew up with. She wore the same kind of clothes she always wore to important occasions, and she sat in the witness stand with the composed expression I'd seen at family funerals, the expression that says, "I am holding myself together for the people who need me to." She said she had genuinely believed, based on something she was told by someone she trusted, that there was a question about my daughter's paternity. She said she'd only wanted to protect the integrity of our father's wishes. Buchanan asked her who had told her there was a question. My sister said she couldn't recall. Buchanan asked her why, if she was acting in good faith, the affidavit had been obtained through an intermediary with no medical relationship to my wife or daughter. My sister said she'd left those details to her husband. Buchanan asked her whether she was aware that the notarization on the affidavit was logged to a date on which the notary in question had documented no appointments. My sister said she had no knowledge of that. Buchanan said she had no knowledge of that. Buchanan said she had no further questions. The jury deliberated for 4 hours. Guilty on all counts for both of them. My brother-in-law received 32 months in federal prison plus restitution. My sister received a suspended sentence, 5 years probation, and 200 hours of community service, reduced in exchange for her cooperation in the case against the physician, who ultimately surrendered his license and pled to a separate charge. I stood outside the courthouse afterward. It was April, one of those days where the light is honest and the air still has winter in it. Camille was beside me. The baby was with her mother. Buchanan came out and shook my hand and said what prosecutors say when a case closes the way it's supposed to. I thanked her and meant it. On the drive home, Camille asked me if I felt better. I thought about it for real before I answered. "I feel like it's over," I said. "That's different from better." She reached over and put her hand on mine on the console. "It's enough for now." She was right. It was. I sent my sister one letter 6 weeks after sentencing. I didn't tell her I forgave her. I didn't tell her I didn't. I told her that our father loved her, that I was certain of that, and that I thought she should spend some time thinking about what she was willing to trade for the things she wanted. I told her I hoped the time ahead of her would be useful to her in whatever way time can be useful to a person who has done what she did. I sealed it and mailed it and haven't written another since. My daughter is 14 months old now. She walks with the confidence of someone who has been doing it for years and has no patience for the instability of the process. She says 4 words clearly and several others as approximations she expects you to decode. She has my father's eyes, the specific shade of gray-green that photographs as blue and looks like river water in person. The first time I noticed it, I had to leave the room for a minute. I kept practicing medicine. I kept going to the VA clinic on Tuesdays. I kept doing the word that feels like the truest version of what I'm for. I don't think about the trust most days. My daughter's name is back on the documents, listed correctly, protected by additional provisions the estate attorney added at my request. Some nights I still get the particular kind of tired that comes from a double shift, and I sit in the parking garage for 10 minutes before I drive home. I still check my phone during those 10 minutes out of habit. But now, when I look at the screen, there's nothing waiting for me except the ordinary messages of a life that has found its level again. I go inside. I hold my daughter, I sit across from my wife at the kitchen table, and we talk about the small things. The next morning, I get up and do it again. And it's enough. It's more than enough. It's everything. The thing I keep coming back to is the baby shower. My sister standing in our living room with streamers and a cake and a gift she'd wrapped herself, holding Camille's hands and crying. Those weren't performed tears. I've watched enough people at their worst to know the difference between a person performing grief and a person feeling it. She felt something real that day. And then 6 weeks later, she filed paperwork to remove my daughter's name from the legal record of our family. I used to think those two things couldn't coexist in the same person. I don't think that anymore. What I learned from all of this, not as a lesson I was handed, but as something I had to work out slowly, in parking garages and filing cabinets and prosecutors' offices, is that the people who cause the most damage are rarely the ones who feel nothing. They're the ones who feel everything and still make the wrong choice anyway. My sister wasn't a monster. She was a person who wanted something badly enough that she found a way to stop seeing my daughter as a child and start seeing her as an obstacle. That's a moral failure, and I don't use that phrase casually. It's a specific thing that happens when a person lets want override what they know is right, when they stop asking, is this true, and start asking, how do I make this work? I made a choice early on not to let that same mechanism operate in me, not because I'm better than her, but because I've seen what happens when it does. I've worked on people who made one decision in a moment of panic or rage that they spent the rest of their lives trying to live around. The operating room doesn't give you a lot of room for self-deception. You either know what you're doing or you don't, and the work shows the difference. So I did the thing I knew how to do. I slowed down. I found the shape of what was happening before I responded to it. I built a case instead of making a scene. That's not coldness. People sometimes read composure as coldness, especially when someone is hurting. It's not. It's the decision to let your understanding of a situation be more useful than your feelings about it, while still letting yourself feel. I felt everything. I just didn't lead with it. And I want to say something about endurance, because it doesn't get enough credit. 11 weeks of Sunday dinners. 11 weeks of watching my brother-in-law shake my hand. That kind of sustained patience isn't easy, and it isn't passive. It takes a particular kind of internal steadiness to hold a course when every instinct is telling you to confront, to react, to make them understand what they've done. Steadiness isn't the absence of urgency. It's urgency that has learned to wait. My daughter will be told this story when she's old enough to understand it, not to make her angry at the aunt she'll likely never know well, but because she deserves to know that before she existed, someone tried to erase her, and her parents didn't fall apart. They paid attention. They documented. They trusted the process and the people who knew how to work within it. That's what I want her to carry, not the injury, but the response. What happened to us happened because someone chose greed over integrity and assumed we wouldn't look closely. The consequences that followed weren't punishment in any cosmic sense. They were just the predictable result of that choice meeting someone who had spent years learning how to look closely at hard things and not blink. My daughter is 14 months old. She doesn't know any of this yet. She just knows the mobile above her crib and the sound of my voice and the fact that when she makes her small complaint sound, someone always comes. That's what we protected. That's what it was always about.